The Law Enforcement Survival Institute and CopsAlive.com welcome you to this Tactical Resilience and Ethical Policing live webcast. Stand by and your hosts will be with you in just a moment. Okay. Hello, everybody. This is John Marx. I'm the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. Thank you for joining us today. We have kind of an exciting topic that I am very interested to discuss. Last month, if you remember, we talked about mentoring in law enforcement, and we had a really good discussion about some of the positive effects that mentoring has both formally and informally. And then we kind of came across the topic we're going to discuss today, which is negative mentoring, or what we're calling reverse mentoring. And we want to discuss how this impacts our profession and maybe what we can do about it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our co-host today and ask him to take the lead. And before I forget, I just want to ask, we would welcome everyone to join in the discussion. There are a number of you out there. If you do join in the discussion, please just introduce yourself to us so that we know who you are and from what perspective you bring your ideas. But I would like to introduce my co-host, who is an Associate Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, Chaplain Carrie Friedman. Carrie, would you introduce yourself and sort of kick us off here?
Okay, nice to be on this webinar. John, thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge our best friend in the whole world, Bill Radcliffe.
He is truly our biggest fan. I love
it. And conversely, we are your biggest fans. Although that's a little arrogant for us to say because there's an army of people out there who love and admire and respect you. But we like to think of ourselves, we number ourselves among that ever-growing crowd. So thank you.
It was my golden retriever did, but he died.
We might have to pyour peer support for that.
Well, I know that the last few times that we've done this is our third webinar. Your insights have been invaluable. So we're looking forward to more of that. The topic we're discussing today, we're talking about certain negative kind of role models, cautionary tales, and as John mentioned, that flows out of the conversation we had last time. The foundation, the underpinnings for these kind of discussions is a recognition of the fact that human beings are very social creatures. We need to interact with people. And we are influenced by and we emulate the people with whom we associate. So just being in the environment of certain kind of people, we start over time to take on some of their characteristics. What we were talking about last time was consciously using that fact in a positive kind of way. We were talking about positive role models. We were talking about interacting, associating with certain kind of people who are our peers, our colleagues, our equals, and deriving strength from them if they're positive kind of people. We also talked about, John, just correct me if I'm wrong, I think we talked about having mentors and teachers, people to whom we turn and who give us advice and guidance. And I think one of the takeaways from last webinar was the importance of having somebody we can turn to. That person we can confide, tell them about what's going on with us, and sometimes giving them a certain amount of influence or authority where they can listen to us and they'd say, what are you, nuts? I mean, being an objective kind of person, a third party, somebody who's outside, endows people very often with a lot of clarity. Right? I shouldn't say endows them with clarity. We all have clarity if we're looking at somebody else and the way they're behaving. When we're involved, suddenly we start coming up with all kinds of self-serving logical analyses that aren't really driven by logic. They're driven by all kinds of agendas that we have within. We kind of know where we want to go. We know the conclusion we want to reach. So suddenly we use our logic to help get us there. And because we're all wrapped up in the issue and we're not really thinking clearly, the ability to turn to somebody who is either a peer or a mentor, describe to them what we're thinking, what we're planning on doing, and then they can listen, they can respond and say, that doesn't make a lot of sense, you're fooling yourself or something. So I would hope that one of the takeaways from last webinar was a recognition of the importance of having somebody who can be that kind of person or that group of people to whom you would be accountable, and you could check in with them, ask their advice, etc. Just very flowing very logically, very naturally from that, if we're talking about positive role models, is the flip side, which is the darker, the seamy underside, which is a lot of times in the course of our lives, whether it's peers, colleagues, as we mentioned, friends, or people who are above us, they can sometimes be negative influences. And then that same kind of process, same phenomenon of, the people around us, their influence kind of oozing towards us, and we absorb that, it can happen for the negative as well. And I think, and John, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, and Bill, I'd love you to weigh in. We have another person who has joined us, I see, and I'd love to get your insight, your input in as to, if you've had that experience of people around. It might be that I'm just extraordinarily impressionable. I don't think that I'm any different than most people. I think I'm like every other person, in that I've noted over time, I've noticed that I am impacted very strongly by associating with the people around me. And it's like playing tennis. If I'm with somebody who plays tennis better, I improve my game and I play up. If I'm with somebody who's crummy, I play pretty badly. And I've noticed that in the moral and ethical realm as well. When I'm around people who are of a high kind of quality, they're composed of a lot of, they possess a lot of integrity, a lot of idealism. I think I bring my best game to the whole endeavor. When I'm around people who are, perhaps they're corner cutters or worse, I've noticed that it has impacted me as well and influenced me, and I might not keep myself to the same kind of high standard that I would otherwise. Gentlemen, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Have you noticed that phenomenon in yourselves?
I think this has come up, we've talked about it in-house a number of times with a group of our lessee instructors. And one of our big concerns is that sometimes, in addition to emotional, mental health, even spiritual effects of the career, one of the largest influences we've talked about is the police culture, which is at the moment not what I would consider a wellness culture. And so I think that's what kind of led to this discussion, and that there are plenty of influences to maintain the status quo, to, grumble and gripe. And sadly, because we have people in our profession that are suffering, they tend to draw other people into their misery. And so I think it's a big issue. I think it's one that we need to discuss. And I'm hoping we have kind of a lively discussion today. One of the questions that I have posed here ready to go is, once we talk about what's happening, let's talk about how we fix it, because that's the real issue. I don't want to be another one grumbling and griping without some sort of solution. So I've got a couple of ideas, and I think we'll transition to that. Anybody else want to jump in?
Just from a general perspective, I see it most identifiable, and it's not fair for me because, unlike those who are uniformed officers who have that extra pressure of being in the public eye, I spent most of my career, except in a tactical mode, in just civilian clothes. But that said, I noticed most of the negativity that you were talking about in most easily displayed in a smaller group setting, be it a task force, a SWAT team, or a squad, if you will, and particularly over a protracted period of time when people get physically and emotionally worn. There can be those negative influences that can draw you down, both as an individual and as a group. And so from that perspective, I can see it. And I can see from the standpoint of someone who is a uniformed police officer having the extra magnifying glass of having that uniform on. And then we see what we see not oftentimes, but sometimes in the public media about an officer that steps a little bit over the bounds of the force justifiable in a situation. And unfortunately, there are some captured that get caught up in that. And that is a glaring example of that. But the more insidious type of situation is the long-term protracted negativity that can kind of become a cancer within a group environment, be it a squad, a team, or a task force.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting, when I was doing a little bit of my prep work, I actually wrote down the word insidious. So thank you for using that. But I had to go look it up just to be sure I knew what I was talking about. And interestingly enough, it talks about something that is gradual, subtle, which I think are two different things, and harmful. So insidious has a negative connotation to it. And I think that's a perfect word to describe this, because honestly, I don't think that anyone goes into our profession to be negative or burned out or frustrated, but I do think that it happens gradually and subtly. And I do think that it's harmful. So I'm thrilled that you chose the same word, because I think that's really what we're talking about here. And choosing the concept of cancer, I think certainly erodes everybody's effectiveness and, you know, their happiness. And that's not what we need in our law enforcement professionals. Bill, would you mind talking a little bit about your background? Because I don't know that others know, if you don't mind sharing.
Not at all. No, I retired after almost 50 years in the FBI.
Wow.
50 years, did I say? How about 30? It seemed like 50.
Oh, okay.
30, almost 30.
It's still a lot.
Almost 30 years.
A psychologist would have a field day with this.
I know it. That'll teach me. I spent my career in several different areas, and of not only geographically, but in work. And I started out in the violent crimes area. And then I worked counterintelligence, organized crime, and counterterrorism, and was involved as a firearms instructor and a part of the FBI tactical, the SWAT teams in 3 different divisions. So I saw a lot of different types of situations and worked closely with other federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and officers. And I came from a background where my father was an Ohio State trooper for his career. So I've seen many situations and talked to many different law enforcement officers of different backgrounds.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for sharing that. And I think what I heard you say, though, is that even in a non-uniformed kind of assignment, that it's still there, it's still present, this issue of kind of reverse or negative mentoring. Sure. And maybe we should just talk about culture, but you know, we're talking about mentoring because it has an impact on other people, and maybe more so than the culture does itself.
I think also, I'm sorry, Bill.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to point out that I think you brought something out into bold relief, which is very important to acknowledge. I feel this myself when I'm preparing for any of these webinars, or for really any program that I give. A lot of times I will look to material, I'll look at what people who have, you know, thinkers across cultures have come up with, their insights into the human condition. And there's a lot of material out there. So I will begin assembling things, I'm putting things together, and they have insights into the human condition. There's a lot of wisdom that describes, you know, how people are. And I'll pull that together and then realize that whatever the phenomenon is, I talked about people being social creatures. That's true for everybody. When you're dealing in the field of law enforcement, it's always times a bajillion. It's always more intense. And I think one of the things that you did was to identify a number of factors that make that so. People are indeed social creatures, and that's true for everybody. And if people are in the most casual of settings, they're in social groups, they're just like in a neighborhood, or they're in a, you know, we talk about a tennis club, or they're at the supermarket, wherever. People are in school, whatever it is, they're social creatures, and there are all kinds of dynamics that are going on that influence people. They're impacted one from the other, the people around them. When you're dealing with law enforcement, the factors that multiply that a millionfold, there are just so many of them. And the kind of feedback mechanism that John and you were describing before, that the career, something about the career produces real negativity in people. They don't just keep it to themselves. They share it with the people around them and they infect them. I mean, that illness, that model of an illness you were talking about, I think is an excellent one. They infect the people around them, and then there's a feedback mechanism where they just keep infecting each other, and it kind of spirals up and up and up and up and up and up. So whatever is true about, regular kinds of people living regular kind of lives, for law enforcement officers, whether they're in civilian clothes or whether they're in uniform, whatever, it's just going to be so much more intensely experienced, and it's going to impact them all that more. So I think that's important to recognize that really any issue that we come up, John, I'm sure you've had the same experience, like as you're preparing material and you're looking and you see what thinkers say about things, and you say, wow, boy, that's so true. It's even more true for the law enforcement community.
Yeah. Before we get too far along, I know we have a couple of other chaplains that registered for the webinar, and I know there are some other people out there. Does anybody else want to share some of their insights on this issue of kind of negative or reverse mentoring before we keep moving? Okay, no worries. Let's just keep going along. Also, in my notes, I noted that I think that when this happens, and again, I don't know that we've quantitatively proved that it does happen or to what extent it happens, but I took into account the impact it has not only on the individuals, but I think on their family members and on the organization as a whole. And I think that's how we transition to that concept of culture, because I think that what we're talking about here could be considered the kind of the building blocks of a culture. And so it has a fairly wide-ranging impact. And again, I think the concept of being insidious is so true there, that it just sort of, it infiltrates an entire organization and impacts the people far and wide. So not only the employees, but probably their family members, and obviously I would think maybe the public as well. So I think that it's obviously an issue we need to talk about.
Right. I mean, by rights, we would have to get, if we were to be honest about this, and we were to just, ask the people out there in listener land what they, their experience. But I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that in a hefty percentage, a good number of police agencies, you'd have to call in the CDC or something. They'd get that orange tape and quarantine the whole area, because, to be honest, there are people walking around. Everybody has infected everybody. If it was the common cold, everybody would be walking around sneezing and blowing their noses and rubbing their eyes. And what we have in police agencies, far too many of them, is that everybody's walking around with all of this kind of negativity, and it affects, it bleeds over into everything they do. Like you're saying, it's not even confined just to the agency. Those people who have been, poisoned in that way, they take those toxins home with them, and then it impacts their families, etc. And I think a hefty percentage of the kind of problems with which we deal, that we address in our training, I think could be traced back to just this phenomenon. The fact that somebody back there, up the line, became very, very negative, turned toxic, infected the people around. They didn't just keep it at that level. They just kept then in turn reinfecting everybody else, and it just kept running up, spiraling up, getting more and more intense. I think one of the biggest things of all, because at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, John is a great guy, but he can be very annoying because he pushes certain themes over and over and over again. And I admire those themes that he pushes. One of them is, it's not enough to describe a problem. There have to be practical solutions. And I don't know about the rest of you out there, I have sat in on a number of training programs where people who are, pretty well respected, they have great things to say describing problems. They'll describe problems, and then kind of the session ends, the training session ends, and I'll think, wait a second, I'm not sure that we've been equipped with a lot of solutions. And what John always insists on is that we have tools, practical kinds, powerful insights, powerful tools that go with that in order to address that. So I think one of the things that we have to always be focused on even as we discuss this, is practically what can we do about it. I would just point out, not to try to weasel out of anything, but I would point out that I think one of the biggest tools in all of this is to be aware. simply by making us aware of the fact that this is going on, because a lot of people walk around under the delusion that they're kind of impermeable, like things aren't coming into them. And I think that if we were to just become more aware and we were to open ourselves up and to recognize that in the subtlest of interactions, even without a word being exchanged many times, we're still absorbing the value systems and the outlooks of the people and the biases of the people around us. So if we become aware of that and we can just in real time take note of it, every time you interact with somebody, whatever they're saying, their body language, their stance, the look on their face, everything, the words that they choose, somehow or other they're impacting us and we are absorbing some of their worldview. If you keep that in mind and you in real time, you become a little bit more sensitive to say, well, what's going on right now? There are words that are being exchanged, but there's a subtext. Like I'm walking away. There are certain people in the world, you interact with them, you walk away and you feel more energetic, you feel happier, you feel up, you feel more positive. Then there are other people who are just like emotional or psychic vampires or something. They just, they infect, you walk away with a negativity, you just feel down. And if you can train yourself, I think a lot of us are insensitive to that. We just ignore it, but you shouldn't. Just keep in mind and say, like, this interaction with this person or in this environment, if I walk into this room or this group of people, when I leave, how do I feel? Do I feel better? Am I more positive? Am I more up? Or just the opposite? And if you become aware of that, you can train yourself to do it. I hope by the time we finish today, we'll give some examples, some tools, some tips on how to do that. But again, simply to be aware that this is happening. Every interaction you ever have. You're listening to this webinar right now. It's happening right now as well. We hope that interactions with us bring you up and that they're more positive. But you leave with after an exchange with the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, and we keep pushing these ideas of tactical resilience, ethical policing. We'd like to think that after you interact with us and you leave, you're up. You feel more positive. There's, we've infected you, so to speak, with something good. That's always our goal. But if you train yourself to just keep asking yourself, what is this exchange? What has it given me? Besides, certain objective facts, like what's the mood? What's the effect with which I leave? You've already gotten yourself a very powerful tool.
From what you had said, Carrie and John, I think we have to go back to session 1 and even prior to that, those things about which you both have written and talked about before. And that's a very neglected part about the preparation of law enforcement officers for their profession. We spend a lot of money and time in the training to get people proficient in their firearms. We get them proficient to a degree as best possible in their physical fitness to be able to encounter very difficult situations. And we get them prepared in terms of the legal and investigative side. But it's kind of like people are graduate from an academy, federal, state, or local, and they're put on the streets, and it's like they have it's like if they had a firearm and were handed a firearm and say, okay, this is the firearm, you're supposed to use it, and really not had any preparation for the proficiency. And it's a different life going into law enforcement. A law enforcement career, as you have pointed out, has a lot of different sides to it that other people don't experience. The very highs and the very lows. And unless there is a preparation from what you both have described as the spiritual aspect of the individuals as well as the groups, we're just not prepared as well as we should be.
I couldn't agree more. And anybody that's ever heard me speak, I don't think that we have simple solutions to some of these complex problems. I'm pretty much of a symbiotic thinker in that if we're going to help improve our society or improve our profession, we have to look at the totality of that. And that is, we have to look at the individual, we have to look at the support systems that their agency provides them. And then beyond that, we have to look at the support systems the community provides law enforcement and in every other part of the community. So, I think we have a fairly complex issue here. And I would say that if it takes a village to raise a child, it's going to have to take a village to fix some of these issues. And sadly, I think particularly from the community side, I know the community loves us. The vast majority of the community loves law enforcement, but they are unfortunately the silent majority. And I think oftentimes law enforcement gets disassociated and separated from that. And all we hear are the negative things that are on the news. And that just compounds some of what we're talking about, because it creates a sense of dissatisfaction, of feeling like we're not being supported, that our decisions are being questioned. And, obviously we now have body cameras, everything's being watched and analyzed. And I think at the moment, some of what I would consider the symbiotic solution is actually working against us. So I think if we're going to talk about solutions, and we should, I think we plant some seeds today and we all carry them forward. We have to be looking at a fairly complex and comprehensive solution as well. And I think, as Carrie just said, it kind of starts with you. It starts with a single person planting a seed, changing their attitude, becoming aware, and starting the discussion.
Right. I think if it's okay, what I'd like to do, I wanted to share just a little bit of substance. When I think about this topic, what we've been doing until now in our discussion, we've been talking about it in general kind of ways. I always feel more comfortable when I'm able to anchor something within the model that I use in my training. I'm always talking about the 3 accounts of spirituality. So, anybody who has known me for more than 5 minutes gets to hear my presentation about the 3 accounts of spirituality. But for me, I think it's a very important framework. If you have tuned in the past, if you heard me discuss this, so then I think there's some value in hearing it again. If this is the first time you're encountering it, so then I hope it will help you in your career and in your life. But I use, as I said, in my training, I use a model I call the 3 accounts of spirituality. I imagine that a person comes into the career, some young cadet, they enter with 3 very full accounts of spirituality. Spirituality, the idea of the human spirit, is within a person. And again, let me just back up. I talk about spirituality. I never talk about religion in the course of training, because that's a dicey kind of topic. Spirituality, we can discuss spirituality and we can cover all the important things that we need. We can get all the vitamins and nutrients and minerals that we need to be healthy without entering into any kind of potentially troubling or dangerous areas. The human spirit is that place within us that contains our hopes, dreams, needs, aspirations. It's the part, wherever that spirit is within the person, it's the part that defines us. It makes us uniquely human. It contains the sources of our idealism and our inspiration and our integrity. And I think one of the most important expressions of spirituality is to become a cop, is to enter the field of law enforcement, to be willing to live a selfless life of potential sacrifice. Cops are willing to give their lives, but even more, what they show day in and day out on every shift is that they live their lives to the highest possible standards of idealistic behavior. They do the job, a dangerous job. They do it with integrity. So that all of that is extraordinarily spiritual. So I have seen it over the years. I didn't come to this when I first began police training. I didn't enter with any of these very positive biases towards cops. I just thought they were regular people. I've come to appreciate over the many years I've been doing this, it's almost 20 years, that the young man or woman who makes the decision to enter the field of law enforcement is extraordinarily spiritual. And they have these 3 accounts are just brimming over. They're overflowing. The 3 accounts specifically, the model that I use, the first one I call faith in God. And again, you think, wow, that didn't take long to violate the rules and start talking about religion. But when I talk about God, for most of us, the source of our absolute value system, a value system that needs to be higher and external to us, For many of us, that is a belief in God and all that that brings with it, the kind of absolute moral system, the codes with which we're familiar. But it could be anything. Some people don't want to talk about a faith in God. They are connected. They have other sources for their values. A person might say, I cherish the Constitution. I believe in the sanctity of life. I'm an American and I believe in all kinds of things, for which this country stands. So whatever a person's value system is, as long as the value system is something, the source of it is higher than the person and external to the person. If it's coming from our own subjective values, then we're in trouble. So account number one is a faith, a connection with a value system which is higher than and external to us, and it provides us with our absolute sense of ethics. Account number two is regard for people. And account number three is confidence in self. Those are the three accounts of spirituality. For a person, I believe, for a person to be really spiritually healthy, they need to have full accounts in all three dimensions. A connection with a higher value system is an absolute source of morality. A regard for people, recognizing the importance of people, the sanctity of human life. And number three, confidence in self. A belief that I can interact with the world, I can impact on the world in a positive way. I have the resources, the strength, the ability to make some kind of a mark, to leave a legacy in this world. And as I said, I use the term spiritual health. I understand spiritual health to be, those three accounts are pretty full. Now, it would be unfair to ask of any law enforcement officer that they walk around with three accounts that are full all the time, because every shift, every moment of the career presents all kinds of opportunities for withdrawals. Every time a police officer experiences something, they encounter human evil or things that appear to be just meaninglessly, accidental and tragic, or they come up against situations in which they feel kind of powerless. So those accounts are drained. They're drained systematically over time. Every shift, the most mundane, the most uneventful, contains all kinds of experiences that represent huge withdrawals from those accounts, big checks that are presented against those bank accounts. So when I talk about spiritual health and I advocate spiritual health for a police officer, for a law enforcement officer, what I'm describing is not a static state of, oh, all three accounts are full and they just remain full and you never take anything out. What I'm advocating instead, I'm describing, is a dynamic process of constant depletion and replenishment. The depletions, you don't have to worry. In the course of doing your job, there'll be all kinds of withdrawals. Every time you come across something intense in the course of your career, if you begin to think about this model, you can ask yourself, let's see, which account is being drained right now? Which of these three accounts? Maybe more than one. The withdrawals will take care of themselves. Those depletions, they just happen on the job and off the job. Life presents all kinds of depletions and withdrawals. However, the responsibility of making deposits, the process of replenishment, that's completely in your control. And what I do in my training is I teach people to learn how to identify, to design, to create for themselves deposits into those accounts. So for a law enforcement officer, spiritual health isn't a static state. Oh, I'm spiritually healthy, I'm going to stay that way. Not like that, unless you leave the career and you hide out somewhere in your house. But if you go out into the world and you're doing what you do on our behalf for the good of society, and you're keeping us all safe, and you're being idealistic and noble and heroic, if you're doing all those things, you're going to be experiencing depletions and withdrawals. What we want you to do is to begin thinking in terms of, I need to make deposits. I need to replenish those accounts. So you'll be enjoying a dynamic process of spiritual health. So if you can, and I'll just give you a little bit of homework, this is for a lifetime, try to sensitize yourself to recognizing when you're doing what you do in the course of your career, when you encounter something, ask yourself, I'm taking a hit in some way. Those accounts, one or more of them, are being emptied out a little bit, or perhaps a lot. Which account is being impacted right now? Is it the first one, faith in God or some higher value system? Number two, regard for people. Number three, confidence in self. I think that one of the largest withdrawals across all three accounts is observing and interacting with people who break the rules. There are people around us in the course, like, they could be colleagues, they could be fellow law enforcement officers, they could be people that we observe, people, people you arrest. It could be people higher up the chain of command. When you encounter people who misbehave, either they cut corners in subtle ways or they just flout the rules in really overt, dramatic ways, I think that drains a person in a very significant way in all of these three accounts. And when we talk about interacting with negative role models or colleagues, peers who are negative and they're infecting us, what they're doing is they're draining us in all three of those accounts. And I'd like you to, begin thinking in those terms, please. I make a distinction, and I'd love to. I've been talking for a long time, but I'd love to, I'd love to hear the rest of you weigh in on this. I encounter two kinds of people. When I think about bad role models, I think about people who are, some people are just thoroughly, incorrigibly rotten. And there are other people who are just a little bit bad. Say that again?
That's a chaplain. That's an official opinion.
I'm not saying, I'm not naming names here, but there are people in the world, you might have arrested a few of them at some point or other, but there are people in the world who are just really, it seems, thoroughly rotten. John raises an important point, by the way. Nobody is beyond rehabilitation. We have to believe that when we talk about, intrinsically the value of human life and the nobility of the human spirit. I believe, with every fiber of my being, that every person can turn it around and they can redefine themselves. What I'm describing is that there are people at times, and you might have come across some of them, they just seem, for all intents and purposes, they have been so committed over a lifetime to certain kinds of behavior that, one almost despairs that in any practical way, something large enough to inspire them to change is ever going to come their way. And when I talk about people being incorrigible, I guess that's really what I'm talking about, is that there are people who you imagine they could change, but what would be the motivation? What would be the reason that would be great enough to inspire them to put in the hard work that they would need to do to redefine themselves? Interesting thing to think about. If you watch those old 70s TV shows, so in the course of half an hour or an hour, you see people completely redefine themselves and become good guys, and they have a change of heart. I haven't seen that too many times in my life. But when I come across people who are really, really intensely bad, I don't think of them in the same way as being as dangerous as people who are sometimes perhaps just a little bad. There are people in the world who are a little bad and a little good, or a lot good and a little bad. Those are most of the people we encounter in the course of our lives. And I think that when we talk about negative role models, or we talk about people inspiring us, I think that I'm not sure that the people who are thoroughly rotten pose the same kind of danger to us. Because what happens is a lot of times we learn some of our best lessons from interacting with people, from observing people like that. Those are the cautionary tales, and we think, wow, if I were to sink to that level, if I were to behave in that way, look at the train wrecks, look what they've done with their lives. I would never do that. And I think that sometimes a bad role model can be more powerful for teaching us important lessons than a good role model. Category one, if someone's really, really rotten in the way they live their lives. So at that point, I'm not so, I'm not as afraid that person's behavior is going to rub off on me. I walk away very often. I think, wow, I would never behave like that. And there's a value in that. I think the real danger is when we interact with people who are kind of fun to be around, and they could be really nice people, and they can be really nice to us a lot of times, and they can do great things. But what happens is when we're around those kind of people, we drop our guards. And we drop our guard so then it's possible for them to behave in ways very subtle, very insidious. That word I think is a wonderful one, because it doesn't really even rise to the level where we're consciously aware and we think, wow, that was terrible. Because like we might be hanging around with them and we're chatting and we're laughing. And when a person's laughing, all of their gates are open and they're so susceptible to being influenced. And then people say things, they do things. And when we see people who are like that, we see them misbehave, when we see them play loose and fast with the law, when we see them do things that, they cut corners, nothing gigantic. We're not talking, it doesn't start that way with, some outrageous violation of the law. But when they do something which is just kind of small, might be even a little bit, and oh, wow, that was weird, but it doesn't rise to the level where you respond with moral outrage. So what happens is you've been infected and you've been desensitized. And to walk away with this notion that, oh, you know what? Regular people sometimes cut corners. Regular people sometimes got corners. So you might not realize it, but in the back of your brain, at the back of your soul, so there's a lot of churning, a lot of thinking going on, and you become less trouble the next time that opportunity presents itself to you. Suddenly you don't bring the same kind of pristine, pure aversion to misbehaving that you would have otherwise if you hadn't seen someone doing that, if you hadn't heard them making a joke about it, if you weren't hanging around chuckling and observing somebody doing that, somebody who seems an awful lot like you. And when you have that, you've been infected. And that's really dangerous. And I think that's one of the greatest dangers when we talk about, bad role models. Every human being with whom we interact, every human being is a role model for us. But certainly our colleagues, your friends, your fellow officers in the agency, those are, I think, some of the most powerful influences that you're going to experience in the course of your life. And they wield enormous influence and power over you. I'll let you weigh in. I've talked for an hour or so straight.
Would anybody else like to weigh in there?
I just like to offer one thing, and from what you were talking about, I think there's an author of a few decades back who had been there and done that, Joseph Wambaugh, and his book, of course, The New Centurion and the Onion Field. But to your point, Carrie, the choir boys, and in there they talk about the choir practice.
Right.
And that hits home what a negative culture can bring it's in the form of a novel, but he brought it from personal experience, and each of us in law enforcement know of those scenarios wherein one of those three areas that you talked about was lacking, and it became lacking in one, and it spread to others, and you end up having the folks with their choir practice that are practicing things that undermine that first underpinning of the what you talk about, the spiritual belief, whatever it may be, and just undermines it totally.
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent example, and it's in the for the best of reasons, people getting together simply to relax from the rigors, from the stresses of of a shift of the career, and in the course of that, people begin a path. Dr. Gil Martin talks about the continuum of compromise, and it's possible to move along that continuum and to be able to countenance, to condone, to understand, and to perpetrate ever greater levels of misbehavior. And it starts out simply that, step one is not being healthy spiritually and becoming desensitized to the notion of breaking the rules. And when a person's desensitized, there's no end to where they can reach, like how low they can sink. And it's really tragic. I mean, I think for me, the most important, the most tragic part of it is that nobody starts out along that continuum. Nobody enters the field. Very few people, statistically, I would think negligible. They enter the field to be bad guys. And in the course of doing good and trying to be the good guys, they're subjected to all kinds of forces that act on them that make them susceptible to these kinds of negative phenomena that we're describing. So what happens is, just because people were trying to be good, they were trying to be heroic, they were trying to help the rest of society, to keep, chaos at bay and to create order, to produce that, that thin line that protects all of us, that makes society possible. Because of that, what we're describing are consequences nobody intended. Nobody went into the career and said, you know what, down the line, I'm going to become so ethically compromised. I'm going to be so messed up. I'm going to be so, despairing and negative and contaminated. That's what I aspire to become. People aspire to become the good guys and to do the good. And I think what happens is, when people are unaware of all these forces and they're changed in that way, one of the greatest gifts that we can give them is to make them aware and to say, recognize you're being acted upon right now, always, by forces that are huge. They're toxic, they're dangerous. If you get out in front of them, ahead of them, you can control them. If you don't, they're going to consume you. They're going to eat you up alive. John, I think you wanted to say something.
Well, yeah, and I want to throw it back out to the viewing audience too. If you would like to join in the lower left of your screen is a button to turn on your camera and to unmute yourself. If you would like to join us, please speak up. I was going to just relate to some of the writings I've done. If you've heard me teach, I coined a term in my writing called True Blue Valor, which was specifically geared toward changing our culture and having the courage to intervene when one of our peers is slipping a little bit, and stepping up and trying to turn them on the right path before it's too late. And we've all seen peers that have abused alcohol or drugs, prescription drugs, that have let themselves go in other ways, and we just need to have the courage to step up. But the real definition of True Blue Valor was designed to be having the courage to do what's right even when it hurts. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So to summarize a little bit of what I'm hearing and what I believe, we have to make the change ourselves. We have to start today, and we have to take some ownership. And that means first raising our awareness, and then perhaps raising the awareness of people around us. And I think the best way to do that is discussion. Take what you're learning here and start a discussion. And generally at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, we issue 10-minute training roll call discussion guides. So Carrie, remind me, we'll do one on this topic.
Sure.
I think we have to promulgate the discussion. And I think the more we raise the awareness, the less insidious some of this can be. And we have to have the courage to do that. I think obviously then in some cases where you're outnumbered, and I've sat in roll calls where I was the lone voice about some things. Sometimes you have to turn the other cheek. Sometimes you just have to walk away. But you can't let yourself get sucked in. I wrote down some of the words that we were all using. We used the word poison and cancer and insidious and infection and toxic and psychic vampires. I mean, we all know what we're talking about here. Sometimes you can rise to that tide. Sometimes you can't. But we have to experiment with having the courage to do something. One other thing that I was just going to say, I've heard a lot of people talk about the new wave of new law enforcement recruits, the millennial generation. I've heard a lot of people disparage the younger generation, and I am of a different mindset. I have a lot of hope centered around the millennials, because I've heard, and in my limited experience, I've seen that they don't react the way a lot of us did in years gone by. And I'm hopeful that some of these issues will be tackled by that particular generation, because they won't tolerate some of it. And so I'm hopeful about that.
I hope you're right. I really hope you're right. I think that as we're talking about this, I've mentioned this in past webinars and always in my training, but I'm always very grateful. After I speak or while I'm presenting, people will share with me their stories. I'm very careful always. I leave out any identifying information, nothing, no names, nothing that anybody could ever trace back. I want anybody who's listening to feel very confident. Anything you ever tell me, I will extract that. I will redact all the information, all the identifying information, all the sensitive information, but I share the ideas, and those ideas become they're very important to me as I formulate and I refine my ideas about what law enforcement officers need, what kind of training to provide. So thank you to those who have shared with me. People walk up, they volunteer, sometimes they email me, they send me all kinds of information. I had a case, after I was training one day, during one of the breaks, a fellow came up to me and he shared a story, and he asked me a question, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about just now has been, we're discussing negative role models with the people like our peers, our colleagues, the people who are on the same level that we're on, and they're influencing us in these various ways that we were describing. This young man came up to me to describe this story. He said that he was in the beginning of his career, so he's riding along with his FTO, and in the course of riding around, he said he learned so much from this man. And it was, he said he was a mentor, and he just forever, like even now farther, into his career, very, very grateful for the lessons that he learned, like life-saving lessons, many of them. So he said that as they were driving along one day, his FDO motioned to indicated a certain car, and he said, pull that car over. So he puts the lights on, he pulls the car over, and he looks at this older, his mentor, and he said, why? Like, what did you? So he said, just go over there, ask for a license registration. And he said, just hassle him a little bit. I'm laughing. I don't mean to laugh because it's not a happy story. But he said, just go over there and give him the business. So he looked at him with a quizzical look. He said, I don't understand. And he said, it's my former brother-in-law. It's my former brother-in-law. And I don't want him to know that it's me, but go over there and let him have it. I mean, let him sweat a little bit. So this young man was telling me the story. So he said, as he saw the guy like had slouched a little bit in the chair in his seat. He didn't want to be recognized. Didn't want the guy to look back as his ex-brother-in-law. So he said to me, here we were during one of the breaks in training. He said to me, "How was I supposed to respond to that? What was I supposed to do?" Now that's a very fascinating question. It's a difficult one because we've been talking about situations and influence where it takes the form of influence. The people around us, like simply by their behavior, they're inspiring us in a certain way to behave inappropriately. But it's a whole different level of a different order of magnitude, and it ramps up considerably when you're surrounded by people who outrank you and they have the ability to order you to behave in certain ways. Then that's a really difficult question because, and this has happened a number of times in the Korean American policing where the rules, the orders that are coming down might not be the most moral ones. Like, what do you do in situations where you don't agree with them, where they violate your value system? That's a whole different order of magnitude, and that's, I think, a discussion for another time. I'd love to do a webinar on it, John, and some of our training, we've addressed this at times, but I just, I want to throw that out for those of you in computer land in webinar land to think about and to ask yourselves, what's the appropriate way to respond to something like that? Because the negative influence can take the form of inspiration and influence, or it can take the form of a direct command. Then that's a whole different ball game. And I think that really demands a different set of tools to respond to that kind of a challenge.
Yeah, we talked about what to do for the next webinar, and the one issue that I think we're kind of circling around here is individual leadership. And it's amazing to me. We ask people in their early 20s to step up and take the responsibility of putting on a badge and accepting the authority that goes in law enforcement. And here is an example of somebody who was sort of directed to begin taking away somebody's liberty just for a prank. And at some point you have to have the courage and the presence to be able to say no, because not only do we have a moral code there, we have a legal code there. And, we just can't lose sight of that. And yet that's an awful lot to put on somebody's shoulders. I see that we're nearing the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of people's time. Carrie, you and I, when we were prepping for this, we talked about homework and resources. I know that you won't step up and use your own book as a resource, but for anybody that hasn't read Chaplain Friedman's book, Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement, it blends right into this topic very well. It's why he's very suited to facilitate this discussion. His other book, depending on your bent and how you want to be influenced, his other book about wisdom from the Batcave presents pretty much the same information, but it's presented from the perspective of the Batman, and it's fascinating. So those are two resources I would give to anyone asking me about this topic. Carrie, what else would you like to add? Bill, anything you want to jump in with? And Carrie, you talked about having some homework, so you better get that assignment out there if that wasn't what you mentioned already.
So what I would like to do is to give a little bit of homework, give a little bit of shape to this, like a conclusion to this discussion. And then if it's all right, I'll just conclude with a story from my own experience. If you're really, if this topic is something you take this seriously, so I would suggest that you sit down in a little bit of quiet time and you make an inventory and you identify, ask yourself, if you simply ask yourself these questions, if you train yourself, you accustom yourself to asking these questions, you'll begin to become more aware of what's happening around you. And once you're aware, you have control over the process. these are some of the questions that I would ask you to consider. Make an inventory. In what ways are you being impacted? Which people around you are very impactful? Which ones wield a lot of influence over you? That influence that they exert, ask yourself this, categorize it. Is it overt or is it subtle? Are they saying it out in words? They're being very, clear and direct, or is it just subtle by implication, the kind of ways that they behave? Are they modeling for you behavior with a certain unstated expectation that you're going to follow along? Are you aware of it as it's happening? Do you, in real time, do you think to yourself, do you feel it? Oh my gosh, there's a certain pressure on me that I should respond and step into line and react and, and behave in kind. I think that the next follow-up questions are, how do you detox from those kind of poisons, those toxins that you absorb? What do you do? What mechanisms do you have to reset your moral compass? If these people with whom you interact, if they're kind of clouding your judgment and they're, maybe directing you away from true north, how do you reset your compass and realign yourself and get rid of all those kind of things that cloud your judgment and make it that you reaffirm that, your commitment to truth, to, the truth, justice, and the American way? That might sound like a silly formulation, but it's a beautiful one. How do you reset your moral compass? To whom do you turn, and to whom are you accountable? If there's someone, and again, this takes us to the discussion of last time, if there's somebody that you have identified clearly, they're positive role models, they're infusions of positive values into your life, if you have some kind of a regular ongoing basis, and again, I would suggest, if you can, just look up, we have archived the last webinar number 2, where we talked about having role models and creating a positive community of inspiration. I think it's very important to have that, because if somebody is impacting you in a negative way, and those represent depletions, withdrawals from those accounts, you have to have an equal and opposite process for making deposits and replenishing those accounts. And that requires positive role models, positive peers, and mentors as well. Somebody to whom you feel accountable. So if you tell them what's going on and they say to you, wow, that's really, I don't like that, that's inappropriate, you take that and it means something to you. We are at 1 o'clock. I think we can go just a little bit over if it's okay. I just wanted to share a story.
Bill had something to say. I was going to maybe let him do that before you go into your story.
Absolutely.
No, actually, it was just a reaffirmation of what you're talking about earlier, John, and just saying why we need something in basic training, because just as your example of stopping somebody in the car because your training officer said to, in firearms, you are taught, regardless of who it is, if there's something in violation of firearm safety or range safety, you are taught to stop and not do it. And somehow there has to be, from what you were talking about, John, and then to what you're talking about now, Carrie, there has to be that basic foundation before you get thrown out to the wolves as a rookie law enforcement officer.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, so I just, I'll share this quick story. Those of you who are familiar with my training know that I tell stories about myself. They're never positive ones, just ones. I'd love to tell a story where I'm the hero and I behave in some awesome way. I know colleagues who are like that, and I guess that's effective. In mine, I'm always the ne'er-do-well or something, but I think there's I apologize for that, but I think there's a powerful lesson to learn from somebody else's messing up. I worked in a company. This was many, many years ago. I worked in a company for a number of years, and we had a lunch break every day. It was a 40-minute lunch break. So I was one of 20 people in our particular unit, and we had a boss over us. And then there were I think there were 3 or 4 units total, and we had there was a boss over all of that. So that was 2 bosses up. So that that man who was the boss of those several units, he would pal around with a lot of the employees. So everybody would go out. They would go out for lunch together. And there was a place, and I apologize for the indelicacy of this, Please forgive me for using this kind of language. Right next door to our company was a bar. It was a topless bar, and every single day, about most of the 20 people in our particular unit would go out with our boss's boss. So they would go out, and we had a 40-minute lunch break, and they would be out for about an hour to an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half, every single day. I worked in this company for a number of years, and this was standard practice every single day of the week. So I would sometimes look at my colleagues as they left with I'd look at them with a certain, I guess it must have been that they knew that was a little bit disapproving, and they would look at me in indignation. They'd say to me, "Friedman, oh my gosh, they make the best chili. What do you think? Shame on you that you would think that," so I didn't say anything, but they would leave, and I would take out books. I have religious books that I like to study. So while they were away, I would be engaging in my religious studies. I would bring a sandwich from home, and I would be sitting there eating and reading and learning, and I would pass the time in that way. They would come back, and we would resume the work day. So I was speaking to my mentor one time, and I was telling him about this, and I was telling him that I actually get an hour and a quarter of study of the religious text in the course of my day. And I explained to them, they're going out, and I must have said it in some kind of a way which was a little disapproving of my colleagues and the activities in which they were engaged. But here I am doing it. So he said to me, "That's the lesson, that's the conclusion that you draw?" He said, "I draw a very different conclusion." He said, "You're stealing a lot of time from your company every day." He said, "By rights, you have a 40-minute work day, lunch break." He says, "You have a 40-minute lunch break." He says, "That's what you're allowed to take." He said, "I don't care if the boss is boss." He says, "You're thinking there's some kind of tacit approval. There's an implicit understanding that he's allowing that." He said, "I'm not sure that that's his authority. He has the authority to make that decision." He said, "The fact is, like, you took a job, you agreed to work for a company, you're entitled to a 40-minute work break." He said, "So whatever you're doing," he said, "you might think you're being all noble." He said, "But you're not being noble. You're stealing time from the company." He said, "After 40 minutes, you're obligated to go back and resume working." So I was a little shaken by that. And I said, I see that now, and I was embarrassed. And for the next number of years that I worked in this company, I kept to that time. I would begin my lunch break at the same time everybody else left. After 40 minutes, I would put the books away and I'd go back to work. They would come back 30 minutes later, 40 minutes later. It didn't matter. But I offer that because I think it's a very instructive, it's a very telling kind of story. Because what happens is when we're around people who might be doing something that, they're cutting corners. These were nice people. My colleagues, they were great people. But when they behave a certain way, it's possible we enter into somebody else's reality. We kind of, in a way, we're not even realizing it. We absorb their worldview or their value system. I was measuring myself and my ethical behavior with respect to other people. And insidiously, instead of judging myself against people at the highest moral, conduct level, I was not doing something very different. And I was walking away with a kind of smug complacency, but my whole analysis, my whole worldview, everything was totally messed up. My thinking had been clouded. And I think what happens is that what we were describing today, I think that story really, in a certain way, symbolizes a lot of that. It's possible if you're around people, they're behaving in all kinds of ways, you can actually do an analysis, and you do the analysis and you turn out like you seem like you're doing great. You seem pretty good. When in point of fact, you're being suckered, and your sensitivity to ethical misbehavior, you're becoming desensitized to it. So to have some mechanism, in other words, in the story that I described to you, I turned to my mentor. I didn't even realize that I was doing that. I was bragging in a sense, but I was unwittingly, I was giving him all the information he needed to say to me, "No, that's absolutely wrong." He had that objectivity. He was that third party who wasn't involved, and his thinking wasn't clouded at all. So what I would ask you out there, because John and I, Bill, all of us, anybody who has been involved in this and has seen there are a lot of casualties out there, I would beg you, I implore you to come up with some kind of a mechanism where you become sensitized to realizing that you're being impacted in all kinds of subtle and insidious and dangerous kind of ways. And if you can, whatever you can do to clear away your filter, the prism through which you look at the world, you just clear it off, you get clarity, and you can realign your moral compass with true north. To do that, you need a support staff. We at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, we'd love to help you. If you contact us, we'll help you in any way that we can. We run a consulting service. People call us. We help in all kinds of ways. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost anything to reach out to us. We want to help you. There are resources. Find the noblest, most positive resources you can and get busy fixing and fortifying yourselves. Good luck to you. Thank you so much for listening. John, thank you for sponsoring this.
You're welcome. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us. When Carrie and I were preparing, we thought about, what's our next topic going to be, and we decided we would just let it evolve. So the couple of the notes that I wrote, I think we're challenging people to pick up and manifest individual leadership. And so I think there may be a topic there, but I think there's also one about building integrity. And I think a lot of people, there's no school for that. Maybe there is. I didn't apparently go to that one. There are things we have to stumble through on our own. And so maybe we'll pick something like that. Our next webcast will be in about a month. And you can always find these on our YouTube channel, the replays, which is YouTube/CopsAlive. All of these webcasts are brought to you by the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, which is the publisher of CopsAlive.com. And we thank you for joining us, and we invite you to stay safe and stay well, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
All the best. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on this Tactical Resilience and Ethical Policing live webcast. Your hosts today were John Marx, the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute and author of the book Armor Yourself, How to Survive a Career in Law Enforcement, and Carrie A. Friedman, law enforcement chaplain and the author of the books Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement and Wisdom from the Batcave. We appreciate your joining us and invite you to stay in touch with us by visiting either CopsAlive.com, our training site at lawenforcementsurvivalinstitute.org, or this website at tacticalresilience.org and use the drop-down tab for the online training. Please join us for this semi-regular monthly webcast. You can also find replays on our CopsAlive YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/CopsAlive. Thanks very much. Stay safe and stay well.